Hello, everyone. Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Dale Hunt, founder and CEO of Breeder's Best.
Yeah, you have a great Spanish surname. Do you speak Spanish?
I don't. It's funny that you ask because I actually just got back from Mexico. My new wife and I just got back. We got married and had our honeymoon out there. And un poquito
Un
español.
poquito.
You know, it's very limited, but I do understand, and I can kind of get by with the basic stuff like baño and comida. All
Tequila.
tequila, exactly, which is why we were talking about that. Because you have the Clase Azul Reposado behind you, which is a great bottle,
Right.
man. Yeah,
Right here. Yep.
yeah. And are they like hand painted? From what I've heard, or because they're everywhere
Mm.
in Mexico as like a decorative piece.
Yeah, they I don't know if they still are. I know at one time they were, but it's a beautiful bottle, though, isn't it? It's a great gift.
It's
And I'm under pressure. I'm not sure if I can do this, but if you hit this just right, it sounds like a hotel bell.
I was gonna ask you if you knew that. Yeah, and that's for to every time for like people taking shots. I think is like
Yeah.
pour another one. Yeah.
This one's not going to cooperate. Obviously, it's got some performance anxiety, but it's a beautiful bottle.
It is. It is. Awesome, man. So, well, for those of you listening, we have Dale Hunt on. He's the founder and CEO of Breeder's Best. But before we dive into Breeder's Best and whatnot, let's talk a little bit about Dale's background. You're a plant scientist, a cannabis lawyer, a registered U.S. patent attorney with over 20 years of experience. You protect plant varieties not only in the U.S. but throughout the world. So, Dale, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in the industry.
Well, I never thought this is where I would end up, but I'm so happy that I did. So it goes back to undergrad. I was a physics major, and a friend of mine said, you're really not fully educated if you've never had a biology class. And I'd never even had one in high school. So I found a biology class that fit my schedule, happened to be botany, and it just fascinated me. I can tell you after about the third session, I was just so enthralled by it that I changed my major. Um, and I never looked back. I never really thought about what I could do with a bachelor's degree in botany. It was just too interesting not to pursue. So what you do with a bachelor's degree in botany is you get a master's degree in genetics.
Well, what most fascinated you with botany at first? Like, what was it?
I think it was the way that everything around you has, there's more going on than if you look at it, there's a whole lot that's going on underneath the surface. So, you look at a plant and you see a plant. That's how I grew up. I saw plants. They were either weeds I needed to pull or things I needed to harvest out of my mom's garden or whatever, but they were just plants. And then pretty soon you learn all these structures inside of the plants and how they work and how they've evolved and which ones are related to other ones. And it just opened a whole new world to me of a bazillion questions. I still have questions, but so much to learn. And then I think I have a little bit of my mind likes to organize things. And seeing that there was a way of organizing all of that diversity was it's still endlessly fascinating to me.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially when you start thinking about the cannabis plant, and the cannabinoids that we have yet to be discovered, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, we talk about THC and CBD, but the plant is much more than that, right? With all these different cannabinoids that we haven't discovered. So talk a little bit about, you mentioned the genetic side of it. So I guess fill us in more about your journey, and then let's talk about these undiscovered cannabinoids.
Okay. So what you do with a bachelor's degree in botany is you do a master's degree in genetics. You go to grad school of some sort. So I did a master's in genetics and I studied photosynthetic efficiency in a population of grasses that had some common parents, but were doing different things. And then after that, I was really hooked and I decided to get a PhD So I came here to San Diego, to UC San Diego, and studied molecular and cellular biology. And my doctoral thesis was based on an analysis of how proteins are sorted and how they accumulate inside the cells of a developing seed. And so I really got studying seeds. But after 6 years of that, I was pretty sure I didn't want to be a professor. And I like the big picture things more than the highly detailed small picture things. So I applied to law school. I got into Berkeley, and I took all of their IP classes. IP is intellectual property, and had an opportunity to have a job as a patent attorney with a firm in San Diego, and I took it, and I've just loved it. I love that. You learn something new every day as a patent attorney.
So
And
that's an
yeah,
interesting crossover, right? From like botany, genetics, plants, like learning about seeds, and then you're like, okay, law school. Did you see like an opportunity to marry those two disciplines together at some point, or was this just kind of a random new profession that you took on?
that's a great question. And in fact, yes, I had a friend who had gone to law school he was from my same PhD program. And I talked to him about it. And what I didn't know until I spoke with him was that there's this field in law called patent law, which is really requires to even be allowed to practice patent law with the US Patent and Trademark Office. You have to either have an engineering degree or a science degree or an equivalent number of hours. So it's really a geeky area of the law that it's very much a way of combining science and law.
Got you. Okay, because that's just a requirement that they have uh,
Yeah,
to get in. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, so you're now in law school at Berkeley. Uh,
yeah.
then what?
Then I got a job with a patent firm, and I started doing patent law. And one of the one of the fun parts of that was that, in addition to learning all kinds of things that I'd never studied before or worked with before, I did have the opportunity also to work with some plant companies, and in particular, some basically things that started as family farms and then became, they found out, hey, we're pretty good at not just growing these crops, but breeding them. And we can make better varieties than exist. We can create more demand for what we do. And, um, and then as soon as you start breeding something special, you realize, boy, this is the easiest thing in the world to copy. All you have to do is have one piece of it and you can make thousands of plants. So they realize they've got to have intellectual property protection over what they create with the breeding programs. And so and then as soon as you realize you've got intellectual property protection, you recognize that there are ways of growing your business that don't require you to buy more land and hire more employees. You can find someone in another country with a similar climate and give them the rights to grow your plants. And because you've got IP protection, you can control the potential for abuse, or escape of those plants or whatever, but you can make deals all over the world. And so the companies that I worked with, many times they started off just barely dipping their toe into the waters of intellectual property. And then they came to realize, wow, we can scale, we can put our great work out to the whole world without having to have our footprint in every world. We just have to have a great partner that we trust, some great agreements, some intellectual property. And so these clients that I worked with were able to really get their businesses to the point that they were making more money with intellectual property licensing than they even were with producing thousands of acres of their crops. And they still did the production, but they got to the point that they even made more money with IP licensing. And the cool thing about that is that it gets your stuff all over the world. If you've got a special plant, you want people to enjoy it, right? And to be able to grow it locally but still enjoy it.
And to be clear, when you say plant during this time, are you speaking about cannabis or other types of plants?
Yeah, this is way before I got into cannabis. So it was things like grapes and peaches and chrysanthemums and blueberries and mangoes and things like that.
Gotcha.
Um,
And that's a really interesting business model to think about from a IP licensing standpoint, right? Like you said, the fact that you can utilize the climate in another region to really produce a crop that thrives in that environment just by owning the intellectual property or the patent of that particular genetic, right? I mean, you, like you said, you can control um, that whole process, and you're kind of really stepping out of it. You're really more of the middleman at that point.
Well, you know, you're in that situation. First of all, you're the creator of something really special, right? If this is the breeder we're talking about, the breeder has created something very special. They deserve to get paid for their creative work, just like an author or an artist or somebody who makes a movie. The intellectual property licensing is a way they can get paid for that. And you know, one criticism I've heard is that, well, you know, you put IP on things and it just restricts access. Well, I've seen exactly the opposite. I've seen that when somebody has the IP protection on a plant, they're a lot less worried about, okay, what if a little bit slips out and I lose all the value, or somebody, you know, somebody rips me off. Well, the IP gives you a way to do something about that. But because you've got some recourse, you're more confident about, okay, I'm going to put these plants in Chile, or I'm going to put them in Colombia or Israel or Morocco or South Africa or Italy or all over the world. And I know that somehow between some combination of picking good partners there, having good agreements, and having some IP protection, then people in Morocco can enjoy my plants, and people in Italy can enjoy my plants, and I can access this whole global market. And if I've made something special, I want people to be able to enjoy it. And it's very much the same thing with cannabis breeders. So that's kind of where we're going.
Yeah. And I mean, how difficult is it to control other people not copying your genetics and doing that? I mean, the plant grows so easily, right? You just throw a seed in the ground, really, and I mean, if you're not really taking care of it like an indoor grow, it sprouts up. So when it comes to genetics and IP, I mean, does this happen a lot where there's a lot of copying and misuse?
Yeah, I'll tell you a couple of quick stories. One client I had, they were in the grape business, and we had filed some patents on their grape, kind of in a lot of different countries that had a similar climate, just in case. They hadn't really necessarily identified the right partners in all those countries, but we filed some patents there. And then they found out that one of these countries, it looked like most of the grapes in the markets were their grape. It had certain special characteristics. It was a beautiful seedless grape. It ripened at a certain time. And they knew they hadn't ever made any deals in this foreign country, but fortunately they did have a precautionary patent application filed there. So they did some analysis. They bought some grapes. We did a DNA test on it, and sure enough, it matched my client's grape. And we were able to take the DNA test and the patent into court and get a judge to issue an order letting my client's attorneys in that country seize the records of the people who were doing this. And the really good ending is that all these farmers who just weren't trying to hurt anybody, they were just growing grapes, they all became licensees of my client at a pretty reasonable rate. They still got to sell these great grapes. But and the way that the whole thing started was somebody, they figured out, they through all the process of this legal proceeding, they figured out that the way that those plants got to that country in the first place was somebody had taken a tour of my client's farm, just grabbed a little bit of off a plant, stuck it in his sock, literally, and smuggled it out.
Wow.
And so that's the point. It takes you just can have, if it's the right part of the plant, it can be a tiny amount of the plant. And then you can grow, if you know what you're doing, you can grow an unlimited number of copies. And that's why intellectual property is important. I don't have the illusion that IP is the answer to everything or that it's the right fit for everything. But when you have something that's that easy to copy and that's that valuable and that the value can all be lost, I'll just tell you another quick story. I have a friend who is a cannabis breeder, and he told me about a variety that he had created through, a lot of breeding and selection. Um, that was pretty special. And a friend of his who had a cannabis catalog said, "Hey, I'd love to feature this in my catalog, and I'll pay you I'll pay you a royalty." So they kind of did a handshake agreement. They'd known each other for a while, and then he never saw any checks. He thought, okay, that variety didn't really do very well. A couple of years later, he sees this catalog, and his variety is pretty prominently featured. And so he called his buddy and said, "Hey, I'm glad to see that you're doing something with this, but just wondering where my where my checks are."
Yeah.
And this guy said, you know what it's like in this industry, the tax burdens, all the difficulty. He said, "I can't really afford to pay you, but that's how business goes, just maybe next time."
Uh,
And my friend, they didn't have a written agreement. He didn't have a patent. There was nothing he could do to stop the guy except just basically it was a lesson learned.
right.
And fortunately, it wasn't the most valuable thing he'd ever done. But a lot of people, especially in the cannabis business, where nobody's really anxious to run to the federal government for protection, right? And
Right.
nobody's really anxious to deal with lawyers or to create a whole paper trail of their agreements because of the history of the industry. They're having it's easy to understand why there would be some reluctance to kind of take more mainstream approaches to protecting your work, protecting your business deals, and it's it's not the most comfortable place for people to be in. But hopefully, people find lawyers that they can trust and that are on their side and help them work with the system. And that's this the system. That system is upon us now, and we can ignore it and get kind of worked like my friend did, or we can figure out how to work with it and be protected. So
Yeah.
that's what I do.
I mean, it's really comes down to being better safe than sorry, right?
Yeah.
And when you mentioned that there's that reluctance of creating a paper trail and going to the federal government for support due to this Schedule One, classification. Once that's overturned, do you foresee like more IPs in place and people really protecting their genetics and their strains and what they're cultivating?
I think it'll definitely, people will um, probably have an increased sense of the safety of doing all of that. What's interesting is, and this is one of the kind of I guess the best kept secrets of the cannabis industry, even though I'm um, trying to make it so it's not a secret, so it's common knowledge. But of all the federal agencies that have been unfriendly to cannabis, the patent office has actually always been pretty agnostic about it. The cannabis, the USPTO has been granting cannabis related patents since the 40s. And it has granted a few thousand. It hasn't been a lot, but it's been a few thousand.
Some
And some,
some to their own government, right? Hasn't the government like secured patents
yes,
for like CBD and other cannabinoids? I mean,
yes.
yeah,
And people, that's another funny thing, that that has turned into a conspiracy theory that the government has the patent on cannabis, and so nobody else can get a patent on cannabis, and the government owns it. And that's, I understand how people would get there, but that's not actually what it is. And I've actually answered that question a few times for people, that there is a patent that everybody points at that actually I think just expired. And it's to the Department of Health and Human Services, or to US government through the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's about I think oh gosh, the antioxidative properties of certain non-psychoactive cannabinoids. So it steers away from THC, but it says that some of these protect cells from oxidation, from all the various bad things that can happen with oxidation. And the way this works, and if you are any research institution, any place that somebody's doing research, they their department looks at whatever they've worked on, and if it looks interesting, they in some cases they file a patent application on it, and then the patent application belongs to the employer. So I've worked with a lot of universities, and if I'm a professor at a university, I discover something like that, my university files the patent application. I have an obligation to assign it to my employer. So, maybe it would be University of California, Berkeley, and then that would be the owner. And that's the name that would show up on the patent. There would be the inventor's name, but there would be the UC Berkeley as the owner. So in this case, it was a scientist or a group of scientists that worked at HHS, probably the National Institutes of Health or some other part of HHS, that discovered something, and somebody decided they should patent it. And then, of course, they had to assign it to their employer, and the employer is the US government. And so it looks, on its face, it looks like, damn, the US government has the patent on cannabis. And it's partially true, but it's not as universal or conspiratorial as it sounds.
It's
But
not.
that's the point is that there are a lot of patents on cannabis, and the patent office has never really been, they're not, their job is not, they're not in the business of determining legality or even safety. They leave those things to the FBI or the DEA or the EPA or the US or the FDA. They just focus on, does this meet the requirements for a patent?
Right. Well, that's a really important distinction that you made, right? The inventor versus the owner. And that makes sense because like in the example you gave with Berkeley, you're using the university's laboratory, right? And their equipment and their technology. I mean, you didn't pay for all that stuff. So um whatever it is that you're doing, you may have invented it using their technology and tools, but ultimately they own that patent.
If they're employing you as a researcher, then your job is to do that kind of research, and part of the employment agreement is that you assign your patent rights. And in a lot of states, even if it's not a university, employees have an obligation to assign their rights to their employers. What's cool about the cannabis industry is a lot of the most creative people, the independent breeders, don't have an employer with any rights to any obligation to assign their rights, so they get to own what they create. And the question is, can they adequately protect it? And that's kind of what we help them with.
Right, right. Yeah, so they're uniquely positioned to kind of really own whatever they're developing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, let's talk about so we you talked about how easy it is to copy, right? So the genetics and how important it is to have some IP or a patent in place for protection. But let's talk about those rare genetics, the landrace genetics. Um, from my understanding, landrace genetics, sativa was brought globally and it came through the Americas, but the indica, um, I guess the indica plant kind of stayed in its own territories, right? In the Middle East and whatnot. So those genetics only thrive in their own climate. Is that correct?
I think I wish my friend Rob Clark were here. He's the guy that's written the books on all these things, and he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of this stuff. But basically, a land race is um, a particular kind of cannabis. It has certain common characteristics that are associated with a region and usually a people, a community that kind of selected the plant to do what they wanted it to do. So in some places they wanted fiber or seeds or oil. In other places they wanted the medicinal or the recreational aspects of it. So in different parts of the world, different land races were kind of selected that way. It's a little bit like, in a lot of places, the domesticated dogs are really kind of unique to a certain region. We associate dogs with different dog breeds with different regions because they were selected okay for sheep farming or sheep herding in the mountains over here, or for hunting over here, or for whatever. And so people took kind of a starting species and and kind of selected each generation selected whatever fit their needs the best, and land races are very much like that. And so um, uh, the but of course when people really found the great recreational and medicinal benefits, primarily of THC and somewhat of CBD, but that's kind of become more commonly known and valued more recently. But mostly it was, okay, let's find plants that have a lot of THC and that will grow in a certain area. And so people who traveled the world would bring back seeds from wherever they went, and then they would select the ones that were easiest to grow where they were, or that gave them the best experience. And in bottom line is that most of the cannabis that people think of commercially that are in the legal industry or in the previous unregulated industry, most of it was geared towards high THC and growth capabilities, but and good local growth capabilities. But there's this vast amount of cannabis diversity that still resides in land races from all over the world, and that were selected by different people for different reasons over millennia, really, to work in, to grow well in that region and to provide them what they needed. And what is interesting and exciting about the industry now is that as people that have these collections of exotic seeds and exotic land races from all over the world, um, have feel like it's safer to interact with each other and to be pretty public about their activities, we can bring in a massive amount of genetic diversity that hasn't really been available in most of the plants that are out there commercially. So we're on the brink of seeing a massive boom in the diversity of what's available to people. And it will be for medicines as well as for recreational uses, as well as for lots of different products, including building materials and textiles and bioplastics and fuel and all kinds of things in addition to medicine and medicinal recreational kinds of compositions.
Mhm. Yeah, that's definitely one thing to get even more excited about in this industry is the fact that there may come a day where the world of cannabis markets open up, and that gives us direct access to these landrace strains from all around the world. And like you said, kind of doing more peer review studies where we're learning about how certain cannabis strains from various regions affect us in different ways and marry with our receptors. It's just going to be a wild time, you know.
I think the future of medicine really is going to be very much driven by the great diversity of biochemistry in the cannabis plant, since the receptor system that is that seems to be the most widely distributed in the human body and have the effect on the most different physiologies in the human body is the endocannabinoid system. And the cannabinoids that the cannabis plant makes, and there are over 100 of them, maybe there are only about 10 of them that we even really understand so far, but there are over 100 that the plant makes. When we can get our hands on all of those and figure out what they do and figure out the interactions, because in many cases, what you get from a single cannabinoid is much less than you get by combining two or three or combining some with terpenes. Then you get this whole synergistic effect at the receptor level that really has some great benefits. So I believe that the future of medicine is in a large measure going to be driven by all of the ways that the different compositions, different chemicals from the cannabis plant will be able to treat all the different kinds of physiological problems that the endocannabinoid system is involved with.
Yeah, I completely 100% agree with you. And it's really, the plan is going to be a major focus of all things medicine, right? Because to your point of how each cannabinoid marries with our receptors differently, but then also think about it from an industrial hemp perspective, and how, like you mentioned earlier, the textiles, fabrics, plastics, biofuel, all these other applications of the plant. It's just that basically our worlds are going to be centered around this plant for various things.
Yeah, when you think about the fact that in the 20th century, we are just starting to integrate human genomics, understanding really having access to information about each individual person's genotype and what that says about their own um, propensity for certain diseases or certain genetic challenges or whatever. Um, that you've got that on one side, and then you have this incredible diversity of biochemistry coming at us available from the cannabis plant on the other side. Um, there's and then in addition to that, you've got things like climate change that require a different approach to things like plastics and fuels. Um, it's a prime time for legalization of a plant that really does have an impact on all of these things. And before I got into the industry, I heard people raving about this, and I thought, okay, well, they're just really big fans of that plant. They're kind of, maybe they're exaggerating a little bit. But as I get into it more and more, from a very scientific point of view and a legal point of view, I'm amazed that it really is as powerful as people say it is, both in terms of the beneficial effects for as medicines, but I have a client who is working in the hemp plastic industry, and I look at all of the things that they can do that will replace petroleum-based plastics with bioplastics in a way that, at a minimum, is going to lower the carbon footprint of any plastic use, and in good cases, in many cases, will be fully biodegradable. That changes the equation. We know that plastic pollution is one of the biggest problems that there is, and it's just growing and growing. We know that that using fossil fuels is driving climate change, and that being able to switch to renewable fuels will have an effect on it. You know, that it's, I'm not getting quantitative about this because it's hard to say how much of effect and how long it will take,
Sure.
but it's definitely moving in the right direction. And it's the same thing on many, many levels, that we're going to see the cannabis plant as an integral part of lots of different sectors of the economy as the world opens up to it.
Hmm. No doubt about it. And it's just, it's fascinating. Even of all the examples that you gave in terms of what um, more sustainable goods and materials that we can produce from it, even just putting the seed in the ground and having it grow. I mean, the amount of CO2 emissions that the plant takes in is so environmentally friendly and eco friendly. So yeah, to your point, once this thing explodes, this plant, whether we want it to be or to be around or want to use it or whatnot, it's going to touch our lives in some capacity.
Well, it's so powerful that it survived all those years of the war on drugs and illegality. It really has such a powerful effect and offers so many benefits that it's still around, and it's already a multi-billion-dollar industry on the legal side. It has been a big money um, uh, industry, I guess you'd call it, before regulation. And I think it's really because there are people, and I've gotten to know people like this, people who really believe in the benefits of having a life that interacts with that plant. You know, that if you look at the fact that the endocannabinoid system is so very much uh, involved in so much of our body, it's no surprise that people who really understand all the benefits the plant can bring are really deeply committed to it.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And we're only just scratching the surface and talking about the cannabinoids, which, you know, those are active molecules. But what about all the other molecule, like the terpenes, the flavonoids, right? I mean, you start talking about those and what they can do with our endocannabinoid system. It's just like you said, the possibilities will be endless one day once we can start to piece these things together in a way that helps us with certain ailments.
It's very true. One of the things that I learned as a patent attorney, that I love being able to extend it to this industry. I worked with a company that was making natural insecticides, and so the story is, I'll try to keep this quick, but it's a really interesting story. There was a professor who was studying cancer cells in culture, and he was using essential oils just because there was a big diverse supply of essential oils and they're inexpensive, and he was looking to see if any of these would have an effect on the receptors of cancer cells. And one day, the air conditioning in the medical research building where he worked went out, and it was really hot day. Everybody opened their windows in that building, and the entire building filled up with bugs, except his lab didn't have any bugs in it. Being a good scientist, he asked why, and he thought maybe it has to do with all these essential oils in my lab, because, you know, essential oils came from, they're a plant defense molecule, and plants evolved these to defend themselves from bugs. So he had part of it, his lab was all about cancer receptors, but he put part of his lab's effort on studying insect receptors. And what he found by doing some molecular assays of what happens when a receptor touches a target, he found that there were certain essential oils that would have strong effects on the nervous system of insects, but didn't have any of the same kinds of effects on mammals or on vertebrate animals. So then this is where I'm going with this. He looked at pairwise combinations of these things and found that in some cases, the combinations, you know, if you had an effect of, say, 20 with one and 10 with another, you put them together and you got 500. There's these synergies that would happen when the receptor, either the same receptor is activated by two different ligands, they call them, or when two receptors that are working on the same system both see a different target at the same time. that there's this incredibly synergistic effect. And it doesn't always happen. In some cases, you put 20 plus 10 and you get -5. And so but the point is that receptors, the receptor system, whether it's in insects or in humans, is very much its job is to perceive what's out there, what signals the environment is giving it, and to react to them. And when we think about that in terms of cannabinoids and terpenes and flavonoids, there are receptors that pick up signals in the form of terpenes, and other receptors that pick up signals in the form of cannabinoids. And you can have the same receptor that will react in one way to THC and in a different way to THCV or to CBG or whatever. And so um, as soon as you take advantage of all of these synergies, and there's a whole lot to study there, and that's the whole point of the entourage effect, is that when you have one thing, it can have an effect. When you combine it with something else, there's not just a more powerful effect, but some new effects. And there's so much for us to learn about all of these potential synergies and all of the ways that can heal people and make them better, make them enjoy life more. And we are really on the brink of just an explosion of information in this front, an explosion of benefits to people all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm so glad you mentioned the entourage effect. When I first started this podcast, I had a geneticist on by the name of Adam Jocks. He's one of the godfathers when it comes to genetics and breeding and growing. I mean, he's really, really great. And he was talking about the entourage effect and the difference between full spectrum and broad spectrum or isolate, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he's like, if you're going with isolate, it's really like you're throwing the baby out of the bathtub, like you're not full, that full entourage effect where your receptors marry with those cannabinoids or those flavonoids or those terpenes. So that it's very interesting and again, very exciting that the future, what the future holds, right, in terms of the learnings and whatnot. And speaking of that, and what we're about to discover, what are you seeing in terms of the undiscovered cannabinoids? We talk about cannabinoids 1 and 2, THC, CBD. Then we have 3 through 10, which I don't even know if 3 through 10. I know CBG. I know somewhat of what that is, and CBN, but that's really my knowledge kind of ends there. But what have you learned in terms of like 11 through 150? I mean, are there other cannabinoids that we're learning about, and where is that headed?
Yeah. So, and I wish Ethan Russo were here to help us with this discussion, because he's definitely the expert on this stuff. But yeah, so there are some cannabinoids. We know THC and CBD. We kind of know what they do. They went from being illegal to, well, now your grandma is on CBD and probably her dog too, right? So CBD is getting to be really well known. But then there are other cannabinoids that we're just starting to hear about, but that are present at high enough levels in plants that people can purify them and study them. And I'm not saying purify them for use as much as purifying them for study. But so a few of these, and I'm certainly not encyclopedic in my knowledge of this, but that's what people like Ethan are for. There's CBC and CBN and CBG, and then THCV and CBDV, and all these variants of the core kind of structure. And each one that's been studied so far has different physiological effects. And so when I look at what we know about so I call these, just to put some labels on them, I call THC and CBD the major cannabinoids. Those are the ones that are already big business and very accessible. Then 3 through 10, and it might be 3 through 12, but there's some other number of things that are available enough that people can start to understand what they do, and then start to understand what they do in combination with other things, with other cannabinoids and other terpenes. But people who study the biochemistry of this and do the gas chromatography and the mass spectrometry to identify other cannabinoids have found peaks or some characteristics in a chromatograph or in some other biochemical assay to say that there are at least maybe a total of 150, and some people will say that it's in the many hundreds. But let's just say for the sake of this discussion that it's 150. So there's another, maybe 140 or so, 135 that people at least see their footprints, they see that they're there, but nobody has purified to high enough levels that they can start to understand how they interact with the receptors, what they do, and then what they do in combinations with other cannabinoids. And if you recognize that every single one that's been studied so far has its own unique constellation of beneficial effects, you would ask yourself, okay, how likely is it that there are going to be some other beneficial effects in these other 135 or more that are yet to be studied? And to me, I would say that the future of pharmaceuticals, the future of medicine, and I don't mean just prescription pharmaceuticals, I really mean the future of people being able to medicate themselves under the care of a physician or under their own care. Um, I believe that's where the future of medicine is. That finding these other cannabinoids, and then learning how they interact with the body as well as with other terpenes, other cannabinoids, and flavonoids is going to open up. It's going to make the old school pharmaceutical system seem so. It'll seem like leeches and bloodletting, because one of the things is you look at any synthetic drug right now has to be delivered with enough potency that it can work on its own. I've talked about the power of synergy, but synthetic drugs, to get through through the FDA process, you've got to have it be extremely pure, extremely consistent, and it's one molecule. So you're asking the body to do something to react to one molecule where it's attuned to read a lot of signals and build a reaction coming from a lot of signals. The body is built for synergy. But if you give something a single purified molecule, you've got to give that enough of it that it can be potent enough to act on its own. That's why you get so damn many, so many side effects. When you give somebody a single molecule and you give it in a high enough dose that you're getting an effect, you've got all this noise around it in terms of, and that's where the side effects really, that's why we see so many side effects with pharmaceutical drugs. Now, if you can take advantage of synergy, you can give much lower doses of things and still get beneficial effects. In addition, um, nobody's ever died from an overdose of cannabinoids. The receptors in the brainstem that tell your body to stop, to tell your heart to stop beating or tell you to stop breathing, those receptors do not interact with the cannabinoids. Those are primarily the receptors that opiates can shut down, which is why people die from an opiate overdose or certain other kinds of drugs. But the molecular reason why nobody's ever been able, there's no proof that anyone has ever died from a cannabis overdose, is because it doesn't shut down the brainstem in the same way that the other drug overdoses do. So that was kind of an answer that went a lot of different directions, but I hope there's something useful in there.
No, I love it. I'm chomping at the bit here because there's so much to unpack with what you said. And that fact, I love that you brought up, the fact that there's no evidence of anyone ever dying of an overdose of cannabis. And that fact alone it just astounds me that it's still classified as a Schedule 1 narcotic, So outside of that, um, what you were saying in terms of how the big pharma develops and creates these synthetic drugs, it's also at random, right? I mean, like, it's not like how you're talking about with synergies of cannabinoids and how they marry with our endocannabinoid system. It's like they have one molecule, these big pharma companies, and then they build off of that to find out what it will do with when it comes to certain illnesses or pain or what have you, right? I mean, it's kind of at random, and it's not where we're looking at the human biology and thinking, okay, what can we develop, what chemical molecule that can we develop that will actually bind with the receptor and activate it, right?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to when I was a new patent attorney, the sexy thing that people talked about was combinatorial chemistry and high throughput screening. And what that meant was you start with some kind of chemical background and you do some synthetic chemistry to make as many variations on it as you can. And then you put it through a high throughput process so you can have 1,000 variations that you can test each one of those on a living cell of some kind to see what happens. And so it is very much, let's make a whole bunch of things and throw them against the wall and see which ones stick. and try to understand why. And it's certainly people are benefiting from that process, but to go back to the whole receptor concept, what you're doing when you do that is you're finding some molecular form that will bind a receptor and cause an effect in a cell. But if, as I said, if receptors are evolved and their normal function is to pick up very small amounts of things and factor that into the other signals that the body is seeing, um, and you're trying to get a physiological effect from a single dose of a single molecule, then you often, not always, but often you have to hit it so hard to get that effect that without the benefit of synergy, that you end up with a lot of side effects. And so the whole FDA process, the reason it's so complicated and so time consuming and so expensive is you start with something that your lab studies have shown you, oh, there's a potential valuable effect here. So first we have to test it in a few volunteers to see if it's how safe it is. And if it doesn't kill anybody, then we can go to look at effective doses, and we get through enough things that the FDA finally approves it. And everybody who's ever heard a pharmaceutical commercial, they hear all the list of, this will make your toes fall off, or not in very many cases, but if you do see a toe fall off, call your doctor.
Yeah,
And
that's what I was gonna bring that up. It's like you mentioned earlier, we're gonna look back at these times when we get to the future of medicine, how you explained, and we're gonna kind of laugh at it. And that's one prime example. You got these beautiful families playing in the park, and holding hands and skipping rope. And then they're saying side effects may include loss of, heartbeat, loss of breathing, diarrhea. It's just, and it goes on and on. It's about a minute, of all
yeah,
the effects. It's crazy. But I saw
yeah.
interrupt. Yeah, go ahead.
And by the time something gets through the FDA process, typically those side effects are going to be relatively few, or else it won't be approved. At low frequency, there might be a lot of them, but they won't happen a lot of times. But when they do happen, it's pretty serious. And so, the benefit, I think that the age that we're going into is kind of like going full circle. There are people who are called ethnobotanists that study the kind of the community knowledge of how plant medicines treat people's different conditions, and then they try to learn from those plant medicines. But in the early days of ethnobotany were to say, okay, well, they would give them this plant and somehow they got better, so let's dissect it down to the single molecule in this plant that has value as a pharmaceutical. And I think in many cases they were missing the entourage effects of those plants, and they were getting down to one molecule that then, when you gave it in a strong enough dose to work all by itself, it brought all these side effects that you didn't see in the ethnobotany history.
Right.
So I do think that in a way we are coming full circle to some of the kind of traditional medicines that don't have the same kinds of side effects. And it's not even because plants are better than chemical labs, although I think most of us would feel that way. But it's really because you're not asking a single molecule to do all the work. You're letting things happen the way the body evolved for things to happen, which is perceiving a lot of different signals at once and reacting to them. And so, yeah, I think we are, that's the future of medicine. It's a very exciting one.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Well, we've touched on a lot, Dale. I do want to give you a chance to talk about your company, Breeder's Best. So why don't you, just give us an overview and what the mission is for Breeder's Best?
Okay. So we talked about the fact that I'm a patent attorney and I've been in the cannabis industry and I've gotten to know people in the industry. One of the things that happened is I kind of showed up for more talks and was on more podcasts and things, is I would get contacted by an independent breeder who would say, dude, I've got something really special and I've been breeding this for 30 years and it's really important, but all my friends get ripped off when they put something out there. So can you help me get a patent? And the answer is, of course, that's what I do. That part's easy. But then the rest of the conversation is, but here's the deal. I don't want to take your money to get you a patent if you don't have a way that to make that money back and more, if you don't have a way for the patent to pay for itself. So if you have a partner, or if you have your own company that you want to do the licensing, but if getting a patent all by itself doesn't make it rain money. You've got to have a way to turn that into some kind of a business. And in many cases, they were like, yeah, that's the problem. This industry is leaving me behind. I don't have big money. I don't have all these relationships. Um, and then I would, it would kind of end up that I wanted to help them, but there was really no path forward where it made sense for them to spend their money on a patent. Um, then I was at a meeting with, oh,
It's very ethical of you to do that. I mean, because I'm sure patents are expensive, right? So the fact that you saw that, they're going to sit on this patent with no business plan to execute, I mean, just wanted to call that out.
well, I appreciate that. It's something I learned, I worked with other clients that they spend their own money on their idea and they're excited about their idea, but then they end up kind of at the end of it. You can get them a great patent, but then they're disappointed with the process because it did cost them a lot of money and it's not making them any money. So I've learned from seeing the frustrations of people in any area of technology that if you're paying your own money for your patent and you don't have a plan for how to turn that into income, um, you're not going to end up liking the system or being happy that you have a patent.
Right.
And so uh, after a few of these conversations, I attended a meeting where there was a lot of investment talk, and I realized, gee, there's a lot of money in this industry, and it would be nice if we could just put the money, the demand, with the creative people who have so much to offer. And so I thought about that, and I kind of landed on this model. I so the idea was, what if we created something that's a little bit like a music label? In a music label, the artists are creative. They don't have to be business people. If they're good at performing or writing songs, that can be enough. And then a music label takes care of everything else. They take care of the legal part, the production, the marketing, and the artists can just receive royalties. And the artists can do really well and become well known without having to be good at all these other things. And they can focus just on being creative. Um, so I thought, I wonder if something like that would work in this industry. And I talked with a few people pretty well placed in the industry, and they all said that is important. That's great, because there are all these great creative people that just are being left on the sidelines.
Mhm.
So then I was looking for the right CEO to run this company, and I talked to the best CEO I'd ever worked with as a patent attorney, and he said, I'd love to help you, but you're the one that should be the CEO, because when you have a startup CEO, it needs to be the person with the vision and the passion, who had the idea and can make it go. And he said, you're really well suited. So I never ever thought I would end up being a startup CEO, but I am. And the one other thing that I really want to say about this is that when I talk about the music label model, a lot of people bring up one extremely valid criticism, and that is, yeah, music labels take advantage of their artists, and then they fight with them, and then the artist ends up getting screwed, and the music label's the one that makes all the money. And a really important, and I heard that criticism, a really important difference in how Breeders' Best works, as opposed to a music label, is that we are never going to own. We'll help plant breeders get patents on their varieties at our expense, but we will never own those patents. The breeder will always be the owner of the patent, and our goal is just to be the licensee, the one with the rights to help them find ways to make money with their plant variety, with their patent. So they will always have the IP rights. We will be an exclusive licensee, but only as long as we can meet pre-negotiated minimum annual royalties. If we can't keep our promises in terms of what we can do with the plant, then we lose our exclusivity. And if we really underperform, we lose the license entirely. So the breeder will have the right to find other ways of making the most out of their IP, but the IP won't have cost them anything. And we'll give it, we'll be the ones that will try to make them some great money from their IP. And so how do we do that? We certainly we'll partner with people in the industry who will do the propagation and pay a royalty to propagate the plants, other people who will pay a royalty, a harvest royalty, to grow the plants. And then there are lots of ways that if somebody has a really special cannabinoid or something, that can be licensed for certain medical uses or for other things. And um, as I mentioned at the early part of the podcast, I've worked with plant breeders in the fruit and flower industry who are able to really scale their businesses commercially all around the world. And that's our goal here, is that if somebody has something great and it's sitting in their greenhouse or in their basement or whatever, and they think it could change the world, we want to help them do that. And we want to put that plant into make it available to people all over the world. And that way the breeder can get a nice royalty stream and can focus on doing what they love, which is plant breeding.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great mission statement and vision that you have for Breeders Best. It's important because, like you said, the breeder wants to keep that creativity. They want to be in the greenhouse or in the indoor grow, or or outside even, and they just want to have their hands in the dirt and do what they do best. And you know the whole business side and networking and finding the right people it's a full-time job. I mean, as an entrepreneur, every entrepreneur knows that you wear many hats. So
Yeah.
the fact that y'all provide additional services in addition to the IP and the patents is great, man, because ultimately we just want everyone to succeed in this industry, or at least the ones with good intentions.
Right, right. And we know that there are some really big forces and some big companies coming into the industry, and we just don't want this whole creative side of the industry to be left behind or to be taken advantage of. And so we think that if we can create IP for them that they can own, and that we either deliver on a promise to help them really enjoy a nice revenue stream from it, or if we don't deliver, they get their IP back and they can do what other things with it. I think that's a way to help them have a seat at this table. It's a big table. It's growing. There's a lot of value on it, and there's a lot of potential to help people. But I think the independent plant breeders have been kind of left behind until now.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, no, that's great. And before we sign off, Dale, where can people find Breeders Best? I mean, throw out websites, social media. Now's your time to plug so that.
Great. Yeah. So we have a website. It's just breedersbest.com. There's a place, if you're a plant breeder, there's a place that you can submit information about a variety, and we'll have the world's experts. We've got, Ethan Russo is our medical director, and there's nobody who knows the endocannabinoid system better. Rob Clark is our director of botany and genetics. He's the guy that's literally written the books on land races and on the evolution of cannabis. These are the kinds of experts that will look at your submission, and if we think we can do something with it, then we will put it into the process, and we'll get the agreements in place so that we can file a patent application that the breeder will own. So that's breedersbest.com. We're also on Instagram. I think it's just Breeders Best. I should know this, but our links are on the website, and then we're also on Facebook and the typical places.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'll be sure to include links to all those platforms after the we end here. So we'll
Great.
on YouTube. Yeah, well, Dale, really, really appreciate your time. It's been very informative, and it's exciting for me to see what potential and the future holds for this industry, because it's massive.
Well, thanks, Kevin. It's been really nice talking with you, and thanks to your audience for listening.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.